Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Space Science webinar series. We started 1 year ago in June 2020, and the series has been going on since then. And today is our final talk in the series. And we have a special speaker, Dr. Dave Brain. He's a faculty at the University of Colorado in Boulder, which is where he got his PhD from. After that, he moved to the Space Science Lab at UC Berkeley, and then came back to Boulder as a faculty. He's the co-I and deputy PI of the MAVEN mission, which is NASA's orbiter around Mars. And he's also one of the main people behind the HOPE mission. He's an expert on planetary atmospheres, mainly working on Mars, Venus, exoplanets. So we are very excited to have you here, Dave, and the stage is all yours.
Okay, thanks so much. And today I'm going to go back to my roots a little bit and talk about the Martian magnetic fields. Throughout my career, I've always had some research, or most of my research, touching Mars and the topics of atmospheric evolution. And within this topic, my area of expertise is plasma, particle and fields, and how plasma interactions can influence the escape of the atmosphere of Mars. But as a PhD student, I was involved in studying the Martian crustal magnetic fields, which I'll tell you about for a minute. And that was such an exciting experience for me to be involved in intrinsic discovery at a planetary object, something that people knew nothing about before. It was incredibly thrilling. And it turns out these crustal magnetic fields have implications for all parts of Mars at all times in its history. And they've kept coming back to me over the course of my career and become relevant at different times. And so I'll use those as an opportunity to tell you about several different topics in Mars science that are informed by the crustal magnetic fields. So let's go ahead and dive in. And I'll say that prior to 1997, when I was a second-year graduate student, the nature of the Martian magnetic field was uncertain. Missions had flown by Mars and even orbited Mars before, not very close to the planet, unfortunately, with the appropriate instruments. But these previous missions that carried magnetic field detecting instruments and other instruments that could allow us to determine the presence of a magnetic field have returned inconclusive results based on different people's interpretation. So here's a Nature paper from 1989 from the Soviet Phobos mission that tells us the strength of Earth's magnetic moment, Earth's large global magnetic field, 10 to the 15 Tesla meters cubed, and then provides an upper limit based on Phobos data that is 3 to 4 orders of magnitude weaker. So this study suggests that Mars essentially lacks a global dynamo magnetic field. It has at most a very weak magnetic field. Similarly, another paper written based on the same data set, but incorporating previous spacecraft passes by the planet from other missions, looked at what was going on behind the planet and placed an upper limit of 4 times 10 to the 11 Tesla meters cubed, even weaker than the previous paper. So again, suggestion that Mars has almost no magnetic field. In contrast to that, however, there were 2 papers also based on the same data set that had different interpretations. This one here used 2 different magnetometers and suggested that there was, instead of an upper limit on a weak magnetic field, at most an upper limit, this suggested that Mars does actually have some intrinsic magnetic field. It calls it a weak magnetic field, but if you look at the paper, it's a much stronger, the inference is for a much stronger magnetic field than either of the 2 previous studies. So there's some disagreement. Finally, the very famous, in some parts of the scientific community, Ian Axford, had a commentary on the Martian magnetosphere where he had looked at the data as well, and he suggested that Mars had a hybrid magnetosphere, a hybrid magnetic field, where it does have an intrinsic magnetic field generated in the deep interior of the planet, but that intrinsic magnetic field is weak enough that the magnetic field carried by the solar wind, the flowing charged particles towards the planet, that magnetic field interacts with the planetary magnetic field to create a hybrid magnetosphere, a hybrid magnetic field. So there is disagreement about the nature of the Martian magnetosphere and magnetic field. And then in 1997, a spacecraft called Mars Global Surveyor arrived at Mars, and it carried a magnetometer. In one of the earliest orbits from that mission, there was evidence that the Martian magnetic field was different than might have been expected. So here's a portion of a spacecraft orbit past the planet, and I think you've seen this in a previous seminar over a year ago. I went back and looked at some of them. Superposed on that orbit trajectory are small individual whiskers, and each whisker indicates the direction and strength of the measured magnetic field. Far from the planet, the magnetic field is weak. And as we move closer to the planet, we see the magnetic field get stronger, as we might expect if Mars possesses a magnetic field. But the coherence scale of the variation in these magnetic whiskers suggests that the signal is not coming from the deep interior of the planet. It's changing too quickly. Instead, the strong magnetic signature is coming from the outer 40 kilometers of the Martian crust. And it suggests that the rocks in the lithosphere of Mars are magnetized very strongly. These are data from just one orbit, and I'd like to show you a map of where these crustal magnetic fields are located on Mars. And I find it convenient for me anyway to first start with Earth. So here's a map of what the magnetic field of Earth might look like if you were in a spacecraft 400 kilometers above the surface of the planet. And I've taken out any information, I've taken out some of the information about strength of the magnetic field. That's represented only by the color of these little whiskers. And every 1 degree by 1 degree in latitude and longitude, these little arrows show the direction that the magnetic field is oriented. And Earth, of course, has a global dipole magnetic field generated in the outer core of the planet in the deep interior. And that global magnetic field has magnetic field lines that come out near the south geographic pole of Earth. And those magnetic fields converge again near the north geographic pole of Earth, somewhere in the Canadian Arctic, but something that's moving. These poles are moving noticeably over decade timescales right now. Regardless, most any place on Earth where humans live, a compass will work. The magnetic field points north towards the north magnetic pole of the planet, and it's slightly weaker in equatorial regions. Let's see what Mars looks like by comparison on this same scale. There it is. I spent 7 years as a PhD student, and this is one of the main products of my 7 years, a map filled with nothing. But if you look very closely, I actually did something. Some of those whiskers are obscuring some of the latitude and longitude lines. And of course, the color scale here is all wrong. The Mars magnetic field is much weaker than Earth's magnetic field by orders of magnitude. So let's change the color scale a little bit from, instead of topping out at 50,000 nanotesla, let's have it top out at 200 nanotesla. So the Martian magnetic field is much weaker than Earth's global dipole, but when we look at it in the right scale, it's not coherent in the same way as Earth's on a global scale. There are concentrations of magnetic field under different regions of the Martian surface, and those concentrations are not uniformly distributed. Here's a different representation of that same magnetic field on a different color scale. Now the color scale refers to the radial component of the magnetic field, and by radial I mean with respect to the planetary surface. Reds are up away from the planet, blues are down towards the center of the planet. Notice that ups and downs are always next to each other. Magnetic fields always form loops. And there are unusual, not unusual, but there are interesting concentrations. Here's sort of a fountain of up surrounded on all sides by downs. Here's something that to me looks a little bit like a butterfly. And if we move back around here, there's something that I think either looks like a jack-o'-lantern with two eyes and a mouth, or in some representations, many of us refer to this as a sailboat region. Regardless, these are sufficiently strong magnetic fields that the loops should extend well above the top of the collisional part of the Martian atmosphere. The magnetic fields stick out above the Martian atmosphere into the Martian space environment. So what can we learn from the presence of these crustal magnetic fields? I was really proud to make one of the very first maps of these magnetic maps of Mars when I was a graduate student. But what can we learn about Mars from these maps? Well, first we can learn a bit about the magnetic history of the planet. First of all, the strength of these crustal magnetic fields is so high that there's really only one mechanism that could be responsible for magnetizing these rocks. And that's having those rocks be heated and cool down in the presence of a global magnetic field at Mars. So just from the presence of the crustal fields, we can infer that Mars had a dynamo, a global dynamo, just like Earth has today. So that must have been active at some point, and that dynamo must have magnetized material all over the lithosphere of the planet. It shouldn't matter where that happens, just anywhere that the rock gets heated above what's called the Curie point for rock, the temperature at which a rock becomes unmagnetized. And then as the rock cools down below that Curie point, it remembers or becomes entrained with the ambient magnetic field, the magnetic field from the dynamo. So the dynamo is active, the crustal materials magnetize in the presence of the dynamo field, and then the dynamo shuts off. And we'll talk about when that happened. The reason the Martian dynamo shut off much earlier than Earth's dynamo magnetic field is because Mars is a smaller planet, so therefore had less internal heat than Earth had. The amount of internal heat should be roughly proportional to the volume of the planet or the amount of material there. Then, any place that you have heated rocks subsequently, say large impact basins, whoops, oh, that didn't work. Here, let me do it. Let me do it real quick so that we can look at it together. Good. There we go. Any place that you've heated rock, such as large impact basins, Hellas or Argyre over here, the material is unmagnetized. Over here where I put the color bar, the magnetic field is so weak that there was nothing really that I was hiding by putting the color bar there. That's the location of the large volcanic province on Mars. And then whatever happened in the northern hemisphere to make it lower altitude and smooth also seems to be roughly correlated with the absence of magnetic field, although there is one magnetic field near the North Pole of Mars that's a bit substantial. So any place rocks were heated, they have been demagnetized because as those rocks cooled again, there was no global dynamo to entrain the magnetic field. And then we know that magnetization slowly declines over the age of a rock, but that time scale for losing magnetic field strength can be 10 billion years in some cases, depending upon the magnetic carrier. So that magnetic field strength decline has been slow over time. When did this dynamo shut off? We can use the magnetization of different portions of the surface. So the magnetic field strength as measured at 185 kilometers, and we can look at how many craters are on each part of the surface. And craters are a proxy for age of planetary surface, of course. So portions of the surface with many craters tend to be highly magnetized. Portions of the surface with few craters tend to be weakly magnetized. And so we know that somewhere in between these two regimes, the global dynamo should have shut off. And this is dated at around 4.1 billion years ago when the Martian dynamo turned off. However, there's a bit of a controversy right now. A recent PhD student from the University of British Columbia, Anna Mittelholtz, did some great work with MAVEN and Mars Global Surveyor magnetic field data. And she found a small crater near the equator of Mars. Here's the small crater right here. And that small crater has a weaker magnetization signature than the surrounding material. That surrounding material overlays even more material on Mars that's unmagnetized. So she can infer that this was an unmagnetized region, that the lava flow here that created the topography did form in the presence of a Martian dynamo. And then the crater, when it impacted that lava, it penetrated all the way down to the basement material, to the unmagnetized region. And this places constraints on when the magnetic field was acquired on Mars. And surprisingly, she finds that the magnetic field of Mars could have persisted to 3.5 billion years ago. On some level, 4.1 billion years, 3.5 billion years, who cares? What's the big difference? It was a long time ago. But 3.5 billion years ago was a time when water was thought to be active on the Martian surface. And so there were lots of interesting things happening around that time. The presence or absence of a magnetic field at that time is important for people to know and understand. So this is something that needs to be resolved, and we're using the magnetization, the crustal magnetization of Mars to help us figure out the answer. Okay, another topic, something that I'm often asked about the crustal magnetic fields, doesn't pertain to the deep interior of the planet, the history of the dynamo. Instead, it pertains to what's happening at the surface of the planet. And I often get asked, can these crustal magnetic fields shield astronauts or spacecraft instruments from radiation? And here is a sort of a cartoon diagram of where the magnetic pressure, or where the pressure from the planet, either the ionosphere, so thermal pressure of atoms and ions and electrons in the upper Martian atmosphere, or magnetic pressure from these crustal fields. This is the surface where that pressure is strong enough to stand off the solar wind, the pressure from the flowing solar wind towards the planet. And you can see that in some locations on Mars, the crustal magnetic fields stick up out of the atmosphere and can hold the solar wind at bay. If this can happen, does this mean this is a safe haven for astronauts? So I'm excited to tell you the answer to this question is no. So I'm actually unexcited to tell you that. And several people have looked at this over the past couple of decades, including me. And here's a diagram that makes the point that the answer has to be no. So here I took one of the crustal fields at Mars, which isn't drawn on this diagram at all, but know that it's there right under the center of the diagram. And I took the same strength magnetic field as we observe on Mars, and I shot protons towards that magnetic field. And I shot them all on the same identical trajectory shown by this green line, but I've spread them out so that we can look at each one separately. And it turns out protons that have enough energy to make it all the way to the surface of the planet require a whole lot of energy to make it to the surface of the planet. And that's because the Martian atmosphere is still thick enough to slow those protons down. And so by the time you get down, and so the deflection of these really energetic, fast moving protons is very small from the crustal magnetic field. The dashed line shows what would have happened if the crustal magnetic field had not been there. And the solid line shows what happens if the magnetic field is allowed to deflect that charged particle. It turns out a typical deflection of a charged particle in the crustal magnetic fields of Mars is on the order of 5 kilometers. So it lands about 5 kilometers away from where it would have otherwise landed. And the size scale of these crustal fields is sufficiently large that 5 kilometers doesn't matter. 5 kilometers is still underneath that magnetic umbrella. However, notice that for weaker protons that don't have enough energy to make it all the way through the atmosphere, the trajectories of those weak protons can be crazy looking, and they can have a lot of influence over what happens to charged particles that are depositing their energy at the top of the atmosphere. So the crustal fields don't shield astronauts from surface radiation, but they can shield the upper atmosphere. So I have a PhD student that's been working on this, and she will finish her PhD thesis next month sometime. And she published a paper in 2017 that showed the same kind of experiment that I just showed you. Here's a region of the Martian surface in latitude and longitude. And she shot lots of particles towards the atmosphere, lots of protons towards the atmosphere at the same spot, and let the atmosphere scatter those particles a little bit, let the particles deposit energy. And each of the particles had a slightly different initial trajectory. And here is the ionization rate at above each part of the Martian surface as a result of this charged particle impacting the atmosphere. Then she went ahead and turned on the crustal magnetic fields. Again, this time with blue being up away from the center of the planet and red being down towards the center of the planet. She turned the magnetic field on, and you can see the gray ionization rate pattern looks very different than when the crustal field was not allowed to interact with those particles. So up near the top of the atmosphere, where atmospheric escape is important, the crustal fields actually matter. They influence the ionization pattern and can therefore influence escape. This is independent, or this is another way of looking at these results. At the location of the yellow star, she plotted the ionization rate as a function of altitude above the surface, and the unmagnetized region versus the magnetized region. The ionization rate goes down underneath the magnetic umbrella, and that's because those ionizations are happening at different locations. They didn't happen at the location of the star. So the crustal magnetic fields are not shields for the surface, but they are shields and energy redistributors at higher altitudes. So while we're talking about the atmosphere, let's go to the third implication, which are aurora. And early on, way back in 2003 or 2004, just maybe 4 or 5 years after the crustal fields, 5 or 6 years after the crustal fields had been discovered, we were starting to ask the question of whether aurora could happen at Mars. And that's because we know that aurora happen at Earth in Earth's global magnetic field. And they occur at the places where those magnetic field lines dive down into the atmosphere, where they are vertically oriented compared to the atmosphere, and allow electrons to spiral down those magnetic field lines, impact the atmosphere. The atmospheric particles are excited, and as those atmospheric particles relax, energy conservation says that they have to get rid of the energy, and so they get rid of that energy as light that we see as aurora. This same kind of diagram could be shrunk down to one local part of the Martian surface in these small scale crustal magnetic fields. And you can imagine, instead of aurora borealis or aurora australis, that Mars might have something like aurora equatorialis or aurora messialis or aurora spaghetti something or another. And so this was a cartoon made based on a map that I had constructed of where aurora might occur on Mars. And this map was made, I don't know, in 2004 or something like that by the European Space Agency. It turns out that aurora have been observed in the Martian crustal magnetic fields at ultraviolet wavelengths so far. Here is one of the first discoveries right here, organized by time. Here's the amount of ultraviolet light that the Mars Express spacecraft sees coming from the Martian atmosphere on the night side of the planet. And as we move from deep night towards the day side of the planet, there was this brief spike of light, and in all of the channels of all 5 spatial channels of the ultraviolet instrument. And the ultraviolet spectrum associated with this sharp increase and decrease of light was consistent with glowing atmospheric constituents, carbon monoxide, CO+, CO2, and oxygen as well. So this was inferred to be Martian aurora. They went back and looked several other times. Everywhere you see a black line, they attempted to identify aurora, and that's superposed on a map of the crustal magnetic fields of Mars. And Francois Leblanc, a past speaker in this seminar, did this work, and we collaborated on it. Everywhere you see a white X is where they discovered aurora in their data. And so these flashes of ultraviolet light of aurora are happening in the Martian magnetic fields, as we might have expected. With MAVEN, we have even more impressive visual confirmation that this is happening. Still in ultraviolet light, we can now take ultraviolet images of the entire night side of the planet using MAVEN, and this should be possible using HOPE as well. And these wispy sort of hints that things are getting brighter in certain geographic locations are actually robust detections of aurora at Mars in the Martian crustal magnetic fields. This instrument has also discovered other kinds of aurora at Mars that I won't talk about right now, but I want to assure you that these sort of spaghetti detections are very real and happen all the time. As a matter of fact, this map shows you where aurora have been detected using the MAVEN ultraviolet instrument, and they are more common and more intense in the regions of the Martian crustal magnetic fields, again, as we would expect. So the particles that cause those aurora have also been identified, and I was involved in that work. And electrons spinning down the magnetic field lines crash into the atmosphere. And so here is an example from a spacecraft that orbited Earth, FAST. And these show the energy of electrons and the flux of electrons at each one of those energies. Quote unquote happy electron distribution is one that follows a power law. It would look just like a straight line on this diagram. Here we can see there are electrons. There's an excess of electrons at certain specific energies in Earth's magnetic field. These electrons have been accelerated to these energies, and that's what happens above Earth's auroral region. You establish a potential, something that will accelerate charged particles, and electrons encounter that potential and get accelerated through the potential down towards the atmosphere and cause aurora. These same kinds of electron distributions have been observed at Mars, originally using Mars Global Surveyor by a group that I was involved in 2005. And by analogy, these are the electrons causing aurora at Mars. These electron distributions, like the ultraviolet light, have been observed all over the planet, but are more frequent and more intense in the vicinity of the crustal magnetic fields of Mars as well. So we feel confident that we've discovered the particles that are crashing into the atmosphere and causing Martian aurora, and they occur mostly near crustal magnetic fields. That's pretty cool to think about aurora on another planet, but the mechanism that causes them could also be important for atmospheric escape. And there are several different mechanisms that we had thought about that could cause aurora: transport of electrons from the day side to the night side, magnetic reconnection, current sheet acceleration. But the one that seems to be most prevalent at Mars is the same mechanism that occurs at Earth, we think. And these are what are called field-aligned potentials. So there's some kind of charge separation above the Martian night side that creates an electric field. And that electric field accelerates electrons down towards the planet. And our observations from MAVEN are consistent with field-aligned potentials occurring on the night side of Mars. One reason this is independently interesting, before I get there, another thing that happens at Mars that's similar to what happens at Earth is that the crustal fields get stretched out behind the planet as they're rotating from the day side to the night side. And a similar thing happens not as Earth rotates from the day side to the night side, but the magnetic field at Earth gets stretched out towards the night side. These magnetic field loops that get stretched out towards the night side can sometimes pinch off through magnetic reconnection, and then these remaining loops snap back towards the Martian surface. And the snapping back of those fields, this for aurora, this is usually happening just after dusk. The snapping back of those fields is called a dipolarization, making the field line look more like a dipole again. And that can accelerate particles and create potentials. So we think this is happening to cause aurora at Mars. An interesting byproduct is that we've observed some of these stretched crustal magnetic field lines. So black are data where there's a strong magnetic field signature in a place where our red crustal magnetic field model suggests there should be no crustal magnetic field on the surface of the planet. So this is a field line that's been stretched behind the surface of the planet. And the particles in that field look very different than the electrons in that magnetic field region, look very different than the electrons in the surrounding regions. So this little loop of crustal magnetic field is filled with atmospheric charged particles. And when it pinches off, it carries away a cloud or a bubble of atmosphere away from the planet. So if we go back to that potential, a potential is just establishing an electric field. That electric field accelerates electrons downward. That's the current. A current then would be upward by analogy. If electrons are accelerated downwards, then positively charged ions should be accelerated upwards as well, causing atmospheric escape from the crustal magnetic fields. Do we observe that happening? And the answer is yes. So there have been several different studies about this, and I'm going to exhibit bias right now and show work from a different recent PhD student of mine. He defended his thesis last August. And the final chapter of his thesis looked to see whether the crustal magnetic fields influence the escape of charged particles from the Martian atmosphere. With MAVEN data, it was difficult to have enough signal in the mission so far to make geographic maps, and that's because the orbit of the spacecraft wanders and precesses over time. So instead, he organized his data by the strength of the magnetic field. So let's just look at the left-hand column. And let's just look at one atmospheric species, so molecular oxygen ions. So this is the flux of molecular oxygen ions above very weak or unmagnetized regions of the surface and above strongly magnetized regions of the surface. And you can see that the pattern of oxygen ions is different in strong magnetic field regions compared to weak magnetic field regions. First of all, the overall flux is higher in crustal magnetic fields, a little bit counter to what we might think of as magnetic fields being shields for the atmosphere. Instead, it's those cusp regions and the electric fields above them, the potential structures above them that are accelerating ions out of these escape hatches in the crustal magnetic fields. So he finds that crustal magnetic fields have a different influence on escape than would occur if the crustal magnetic fields didn't exist at all. And he concludes that the crustal magnetic fields of Mars change the atmospheric escape rate by a factor of 2 globally. And locally, that influence could be much larger, as a matter of fact, above any single crustal magnetic field. Okay, this last piece of information has implications that go well beyond Mars. And a project that I've been working on recently and expect to work on for the next 5 years, in addition to my Mars work, is a big picture science question. Do habitable worlds require magnetic fields? In our own solar system, Earth has a magnetic field and is clearly habitable. But Venus and Mars, the two other terrestrial planets with substantial atmospheres, do not have magnetic fields, do not have global magnetic fields, and their habitability is either non-existent or very, very tenuous. Is this coincidence that the one planet with a magnetic field is habitable and the other two are not? So we have a team science center called MACH, which stands for Magnetic Fields, Atmospheres, and the Connection to Habitability. And MACH is investigating whether a magnetic field is necessary for a planet to retain an atmosphere that could be appropriate for life to form at the surface. And Mars, it turns out, with its crustal magnetic fields, may be a bit of a Rosetta Stone for how this all works. So let me tell you a little bit more about MACH in one slide, and then I'll explain why Mars is a Rosetta Stone. What our goal is for this center is to have the science community everywhere in the world be able to access a framework that we've put together, maybe through a website or something like that. In that framework, a user could select a specific star that has specific stellar properties like the luminosity and the flux of energetic photons and the stellar wind. They could then choose a specific planet as well, maybe Mars, that sets the size of the planet and the composition of the upper atmosphere. They could put this planet at a specific distance from the star, and they could choose whether the planet has a strong magnetic field, a weak magnetic field, crustal magnetic fields, or no magnetic field. The combination of all of these things then accesses a network of past observations and computer simulations that's behind the hood of this model, and will spit out what the atmospheric escape rate is for this planet under these conditions. We have people right now from the Earth community who think about Earth's magnetosphere, from the planetary community, and from the exoplanet community, all working together as a team to construct this framework. And we're using both observations and models in our framework. So we have simulations that suggest that as the planetary magnetic field strength increases, the atmospheric escape increases to a point, but then you make the magnetic field of the planet strong enough and the escape rate should go down again. We also have observations of Mars in red, Venus in yellow, and Earth in blue here, showing how those three different planets respond to changing pressure in the solar wind, and that the response of the three planets is different. A combination of these observations and models are being used together to insert into our framework here. Now, why is Mars a Rosetta Stone? Comparing Mars to Venus to Earth is difficult. First of all, they experience a different range of conditions. Mars is farther from the sun than Venus or Earth, and therefore experiences lower solar wind pressures because it's farther away. So there's a very narrow range of parameter space where these three planets could be directly compared to each other. And in addition, they have different atmospheric compositions, different pressures, different spin rates on their axis. So there are many ways in which these three planets are different. So any difference in escape rate could be a result of those different characteristics of the planets and not a result of the fact that Earth is magnetized and Venus and Mars are not. Simulations allow us to control for these kinds of things and just isolate the magnetic field, but it can be hard to validate those simulations without data from the planet that you are actually simulating. The reason Mars is a Rosetta Stone is because it has magnetized regions and unmagnetized regions on the same planet, at the same distance from the star, with the same atmospheric composition. So we can study atmospheric escape from magnetic regions and unmagnetic regions and compare the two to better understand the importance of a magnetic field for regulating atmospheric escape from a planet. And this can then be ported over to other planets in the solar system and exoplanets as well. So these little interesting crustal magnetic fields may end up having very large implications for all planets everywhere at the end of the day. Okay, so here in conclusion are the things that I spoke about today, things that I hope you at least let wash past you. Mars lacks a global dynamo magnetic field, but its crust is strongly magnetized in some regions. And that dynamo that it lacks today existed before, but shut off somewhere between 3.5 and 4.1 billion years ago. The crustal fields cause non-uniform deposition of energy from the solar wind at high altitudes in the atmosphere, but they offer little protection at the surface of the planet. They enable Earth-like aurora in mini magnetospheres at Mars, something that HOPE might be able to examine more. And the atmospheric escape from these crustal fields differs between magnetized and unmagnetized regions. And that makes Mars a bit of a Rosetta Stone for atmospheric escape, a way to translate, a way to provide a control experiment for atmospheric escape in different magnetic field strengths. And this can be then applied to understanding the importance of planetary magnetic fields for the habitability of planets. Okay, thanks a lot for your attention.
All right, thanks so much, Dave. Very interesting talk. Yeah, and now
wonderful talk, I must say, Dave.
Thank you.
So maybe I can ask a question just to start it off. Not necessarily that it is most pressing question. You made some very alluring detective work, so to speak, of the crustal magnetic strands by shooting protons of different energies. And you also described your students' recent work and everything. Is that the only way to understand the strength of the crustal magnetic field, or are there other things that one can do?
For mapping the strength of the magnetic field?
Yes.
Yeah, there are a variety of different approaches. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold and still have a cough, so I'll pop in a cough drop here. So the first way would be to go ahead and use magnetometer measurements and make measurements at different altitudes above the surface. Mars Global Surveyor got down to around 110 kilometer altitudes. MAVEN at its lowest got to 125 kilometer altitudes, but has been above 150 for most of the mission, and will soon be raised even higher. So magnetometer measurements can only get you so far.
Yes.
On the other end of the spectrum, the InSight lander has a magnetometer. And InSight, if you remember, is a lander that has a seismometer for geophysics. And they wanted to remove magnetic field variations as a source of noise. So they put a magnetometer on that spacecraft. And so it measured the strength of the magnetic field at the surface of the planet. And it found it to be much stronger than we expected. But it only has visited one location. The third method that you alluded to is using the charged particles instead of magnetic fields, because the path that a charged particle takes in a magnetic field is influenced by the morphology of the magnetic field and its strength. So we can look at reflection of charged particles from converging magnetic fields below the spacecraft to map the strength of the magnetic field. And people like Jasper Hallekas have done this for the moon, and I know he was a past speaker. Rob Lillis has also used the technique of Jasper Hallekas and applied it to Mars, and he's made a map at 180 kilometers altitude using particle data to map magnetic field strength. So those are the three main ways that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Maybe a fourth.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
There is maybe a fourth method that could be possible. It's the kind of thing that solar physicists would use, or stellar physicists as well. There's been one paper that I'm aware of that thought about Zeeman splitting of lines in the Martian crustal magnetic fields as a probe of magnetic field strength. And it was essentially not possible given current technology, but may be possible in the future to probe magnetic field strength using spectral techniques and Zeeman splitting.
Yeah, okay. At what rate is the magnetic field being lost by whatever mechanism, for instance? Do we know about this?
Yeah, so the two main ways that it's lost is first, if you heat the rock above the Curie temperature for magnetic retention. But that Curie temperature is usually somewhere between 700 and 1200 Kelvin. So that's unlikely that that's occurring today. Most of that would have occurred very long ago at the time of the large impacts. The other way is something called magnetic relaxation.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's either a quantum mechanical or a stochastic process internal to the rock in the magnetic domains. And that process is typically slow. So
I
the
also
E-fold,
meant reconnection and things like that could lose some magnetic field, right?
reconnection doesn't decrease the strength of the field in
I mean,
the
it gets
crust.
swept away a part of the magnetically charged particles somehow.
It will reconfigure. It will reconfigure that magnetic field, but very rapidly the magnetic field will then restore itself.
Yeah,
Sort of
okay.
similar
This is
to
something
the
we
sun.
could discuss more another time.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Dave, can you see the Q&A? There's a question there.
I can. Aha, hello everyone. I just realized we're in a webinar, aren't we? Okay. Is the InSight lander reading of the magnetic field much higher than that of MAVEN due to the magnetized rocks being buried kilometers under the surface? Or is the atmosphere affecting the magnitude of the magnetic field observed by MAVEN? It's the first one. So if we take, we can use MAVEN measurements and Mars Global Surveyor measurements together to create models of the magnetization at Mars. And so these are spherical harmonic models, basically downward extrapolations of the measurements to the surface of the planet. And the strength of the magnetic field measured by InSight was hundreds of nanotesla higher than predicted by any of those models. And that means that the crustal magnetization was much stronger than we predicted. The atmosphere does influence the magnetic field measurements, both on InSight and on MAVEN when it's at low altitudes, but the magnitude of those perturbations is much smaller than the hundreds of nanotesla difference measured by InSight. So there's the crust, the rocks themselves are much more strongly magnetized than we anticipated.
Yeah, there's a plot that you showed a couple of slides ago where you showed escape rates varying as a function of planetary magnetic field. And so which escape channels did you include there?
Yeah, here all escape channels are included. So it's all of the observations from MAVEN. An extension of this work would be to separate by escape channel, because the charged particle, well, sorry, the only escape channel included is ion escape. So the escape of charged particles, no neutral particle escape is included in this plot.
Right.
But within ion escape, there are about 3 different channels, either through physical processes or through spatial location that are included on Mars, and this is all averaged together for the whole planet. So separating by escape channel would be sort of a next step for this work.
And there is a place where you showed that with varying magnetic field, there is a peak and then it drops the escape rate. And are you talking about just charged particles there, or is it all channels included here?
For this simulation, this is a global simulation of a Mars-like planet interacting with a stellar wind, a Mars-like exoplanet interacting with a stellar wind. And this is just ion escape in this model. But there have been other models, and this model is from a former PhD student of mine, a 3rd PhD student. But there's a model in Japan that reproduces this result, a model in the US that reproduces this basic result. And there are some theoretical back of the envelope models from Europe as well that reproduce this result. The European models especially include other types of escape. They include neutral particle escape. The neutral particles are not as responsive to the magnetic field. Magnetic fields don't influence neutral particles, but magnetic fields influence the reservoir of particles that could eventually escape. So when you include neutral escape, this peak becomes much less sharp, but the basic result remains. The idea here is that when there's no magnetic field for the planet, let me turn this way. If the sun and stellar wind are over here, if there's no magnetic field for the planet, if a neutral particle above the planet becomes ionized, either through collisions or interaction with sunlight, it can then gyrate away from the planet in the stellar wind. But if it becomes ionized here, it gyrates right back into the planet and is not lost from the planetary atmosphere. When you start to add a magnetic field to the planet, a weak one, that pushes the ion upward. It gives it a path. It has to follow the magnetic field line. So when you add a weak magnetic field line, it allows those particles that would have crashed back into the planet to escape. And so the escape rate increases. But eventually the magnetic field gets so strong that any particle that becomes ionized inside the magnetic field just kind of bounces back and forth in the magnetic field and is not lost from the planet. And so then escape turns around and decreases again.
Cool, thanks. There's another question in Q&A.
Could it be that the lithology of the magnetized rock is different from anything we know on Earth, making them good preservers of the magnetic field? I think this is not an area of expertise for me, but my understanding from reading the literature here is that no one is yet invoking new physics. They're thinking of the usual magnetic carriers for Earth, things like magnetite and maghemite that are particularly strongly magnetized on Earth. And then they are invoking sort of larger coherent scales for the magnetic field. So the size of the magnetized region, they're invoking two things. One, the size of the magnetized regions would be longer than similar crustal magnetic regions on Earth. It would be larger, a larger volume of magnetized rock, and that volume is more coherently magnetized. So on Earth, if you have a large region of magnetized rock, say the size of the UAE or something like that some of those rocks would be magnetized in some directions, some would be magnetized in other directions, so that when you add them together, it weakens the total magnetic signal. On Mars, it may be that lacking plate tectonics or something like that, there's been less sort of overturn and recycling of rocks. And so the magnetization is very uniform over very large scales. Something I didn't mention before is Earth has magnetized regions of its crust, but the magnetic signature on Mars from magnetized rocks is a factor of 10 to 20 times stronger than the same signature coming from Earth. If you were to remove Earth's global dynamo and just look at the magnetized rocks, Mars provides a stronger signal.
And why is that?
Maybe the volume of magnetization, maybe how uniform the magnetization is within that volume. Maybe a larger fraction of the magnetic carriers are really strong magnetic carriers like maghemite and magnetite. It's some combination of those three things that's invoked. One problem, however, one challenge, at least the last time I looked in on this field, one challenge is that the insight observations. If we are able to map the magnetic field of Mars at lower altitudes and find that there's a lot of structure to those magnetic fields, and those magnetic fields are stronger than we expected, then there start to be real challenges to what is carrying the magnetization in those rocks. We'd probably need sample return or something like that to understand it better.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's a great talk.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, if there are no more questions, then let us thank the speaker. Thanks so much, Dave, for getting up this early in the morning and giving such a wonderful talk. And we look forward to more of your results and hearing more about HOPE results soon. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. This was a lot of fun.
All right, bye-bye.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.